Okay, we are live and we are joined by Alexander Mercouris in London and the one and only Professor Jeffrey Sachs joining us as well. And we have about 30 minutes with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I have all of Jeffrey Sachs's information in the description box down below, and I will add it as a pinned comment as well. I strongly suggest that everyone follows the work of Jeffrey Sachs, especially in these difficult and tough and very tense times. Alexander, let's just get right into the topics and let's go.
Absolutely. Well, I think the obvious topic is the collapse of diplomacy and where it's brought us. There's been a devastating article in Axios which say that they've never been contacted by more US officials in private, telling them how worried they are about the situation, that they sense that the situation is out of control, that the United States is facing multiple crises, that there's no clear way of solving these crises. And I was thinking about all of this. I was looking at the situation that we see in the Middle East today, and we are seeing why. Because I can see no real sign of diplomacy at all. The Russians are not speaking to the Americans. The Americans are having very difficult conversations with the Chinese. There's no real discussions between the Americans and the Iranians that we know about, and it doesn't seem as if we're seeing much of that happening either. We're seeing huge military buildups whose purpose is completely unclear, I suspect, to all of the parties, and there is no plan about how to get us out of this situation. And I'm going to say, Professor Sachs, I think this is exactly the kind of problem that you've been talking about in program after program that we've had with you. You pointed out how the United States doesn't talk, it doesn't properly listen, it tries to impose solutions, it resorts to military responses. And in a crisis like this, that is both inadequate and very dangerous.
You know, the amazing thing is how much diplomacy is taking place, just not with the United States. Actually, we're in a remarkable flurry of diplomacy. Russia and China, the BRICS countries, UN Security Council meetings going overtime, dozens of speakers yesterday at the open session of the UN Security Council. But the United States is not part of any of this diplomacy. The United States essentially absented itself from diplomacy many years ago when it thought, under tremendous delusions, that diplomacy was not needed because it was the indispensable country, the sole superpower, the country that all nations of the world look to. By the way, all the tropes repeated in that god-awful speech by Biden last week, showing how completely out of date he is, obviously, in many ways. So there's a lot of diplomacy. The world is shifting before our eyes in very dangerous ways, I might add, some positive in that voices are being heard that have not been heard for a very long time. But the U.S. basically, as you said, and I think is exactly right, the U.S. Leadership is non-existent, doesn't get it, and is so out of experience of diplomacy, they literally do not know who to talk to. And no one especially wants to talk to them. They want some cooperation from the U.S. The U.S. has stood alone now in the UN Security Council. This is very notable, actually, when you essentially have 14 countries aligned against one that exercises a veto. That also, from a foreign policy and diplomatic point of view, doesn't stand. And Israel is, of course, in an absolutely self-destructive mode right now. Not only doubling down on a horrendous and illegal action against civilians in Gaza, but dramatically raising the stakes. The Israeli government calling for the Secretary General, who is doing a remarkable job in trying to help the world find a way through this, calling on the Secretary General to resign. It's unbelievable how Israel is saying, we'll go against the world, thinking as Netanyahu has, well, the United States has our back, but the U.S. has nobody's back anymore. And all of this, therefore, is one miscalculation built on the next.
I have to say, I completely agree. I think the decision to call for the UN Secretary General's resignation was a serious mistake. Criticize him, by all means. Criticism is fine. But to actually call for his resignation after he made some very some statements about, observing international humanitarian law and not committing war crimes and trying to put some kind of historical context into all of this. I thought that was most extreme. Now, I have to say, I think that Israel's policy becomes understandable given what you said about the fact that the Israelis have been led to believe for many, many years that they have America at their back, that the Americans have, in effect, brought Israel to this point. I'm not acquitting the Israelis of any mistakes that they themselves have made. But if you're constantly supported in whatever you do by the world's most powerful country, eventually your own diplomatic skills start to atrophy because you don't need diplomatic skills anymore, or at least that is what you start to think. And I get the sense that the Israelis themselves, seeing this situation, one of the reasons they're reacting in the way they are is because they themselves are beginning to become nervous. That is my own response to what happened in the Security Council yesterday.
Yeah, I think everybody is becoming nervous, but they have no alternative gears. They have no mechanism now. They have absolutely destroyed diplomacy over the years because of this idea, this basically false idea that the United States has propounded, that it will get its way and those backed by the United States will get their way. And this is of course, the deep link of the Ukraine crisis and the Israel-Palestine crisis. They both are the result of massive failures of diplomacy predicated on the same idea that you can, in the case of Ukraine, of course, the U.S. has our back. We will join NATO. What can Russia do? And in the case of Israel, we don't have to speak with the Palestinians for decades. Basically, everything is fine and quiet. And, we knew Jake Sullivan's remarkable demonstration of delusion in his statement a couple of weeks ago that the Middle East is quieter than it has been in decades. But when you get my issue of foreign affairs arrived in the mail yesterday, and I didn't realize it was in print. So the lead story of this central journal of American foreign policy has the Middle East is quieter than it has been for decades. In the pullout quote in the front article, you show we are absolutely like the cartoon character that has run off the cliff, didn't realize there was no ground below, is sitting in the air for one split moment, and then boom, and that is what we are experiencing right now before our eyes. And whether they have some adjustment is a little bit doubtful as well, because the president is too old for this. Obviously, is too unequipped mentally for this, from the point of view of his mindset built over decades. Netanyahu is as destructive and divisive as any leader of Israel has been, even before this crisis. And so there is no leadership. The United States, of course, doesn't even have a functioning Congress right now. Our government will be on the verge of another shutdown crisis within another couple of weeks. So this is a situation where there is no evident capacity to adjust to any of this by the U.S. But let me say again, what does impress me as a possibility is the rest of the world actually finding its feet in this because it is gathering diplomatically. China is proposing steps in the Middle East which are going to be listened to. China will chair the UN Security Council in the month of November. That will be a notable occasion for a worldwide consultation with or without the United States. So events are not completely desperate and hopeless, but they are extraordinarily dangerous. This is, to be sure, this is obvious.
Can I just ask quickly, Professor Sachs? We're hearing lots of reports about people within the US government becoming extremely worried. There was that article in the Financial Times that there's people in the State Department who are worried, that there's stories that staffers in Congress are getting worried too. Have you picked up any sign of this? Because these are all rumors that we're hearing off stage, but we've seen nobody actually come forward and propose alternatives or say anything that seems to break from the consensus at the moment.
It's very interesting. The short answer is no, but the reason is that foreign policy really has become a cabal. We've not had a debate in public about U.S. foreign policy throughout the entire Ukraine crisis because it's tightly held by the White House, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, and we know the very few top people involved. We don't hear from the diplomats more generally. We have basically heard from Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Newland, and Lloyd Austin. Those are the faces of this. Congress did not debate any of these issues. Now, Congress is completely dysfunctional. Interestingly, as you know, the American public opinion was moving rather strongly against Biden's Ukraine policy, but it's amazing how the policies towards the Middle East have also undergone a massive sea change. We're seeing a break of U.S. support for Israel. We're seeing a generational change that's quite dramatic. Young people are basically utterly divided on this. The campuses in the United States are utterly divided in this. What we also understand very clearly is that all of this caught the Washington leaders, if you can use a term that sounds almost like an oxymoron in this, because there are no leaders, but unaware of the world, seeing the changing understanding in the world. Jake Sullivan's quotation is not only a huge embarrassment and a reflection of a complete unawareness of ground reality, but is a measure of how the U.S. Leaders talk themselves into a view that they don't have to talk to anybody to gauge anything. So all of this is that we don't hear anything more than what we glean. I don't hear anything more from what we glean in these tidbits, but I think that that's because there are not deep processes of debate and reflection. There is a collapse of an approach before our eyes and not really an alternative process in play. And Biden is not the kind of he doesn't have the capacity of a John F. Kennedy to convene leaders and think through a deep crisis like this. They just don't even exist anywhere in Washington right now.
Mm. Can you discuss the United Nations? Because it seems to me that one of the most interesting things about this crisis is that it is beginning to center increasingly on the United Nations. Lula and Putin spoke the day before yesterday, and they're coordinating positions on the Security Council. Putin and Erdogan spoke yesterday, and they're again coordinating positions on the Security Council. The Chinese spoke to both, the Chinese foreign minister called and spoke to both the foreign ministers of Israel and Palestine. Again, you're absolutely correct. Lots of diplomatic activity going on, and it is centered on the security on the United Nations. I get this impression. I very much get the impression that the United States government doesn't take the UN as seriously as it should, and doesn't realize that this is where opinion is going to crystallize, and that it really does risk being outmaneuvered in the United Nations.
This is exactly right. One of the essential points of this U.S. arrogance over the last 30 years was the very clear determination of the United States not to let the nuisance of the United Nations get in the way of U.S. policy at any moment. And that has been true of this administration as well as past administrations. But the rest of the world is seeing the essential role of the institutions of the United Nations, the UN Security Council, and I will say the General Assembly, because as you've been pointing out many times, the General Assembly is going to find its voice on this crisis. There is a process uniting for peace, actually, due to Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State and senior poobah of American foreign policy in the Truman era and Kennedy era, which was a doctrine for very different purposes. But it said if there's a complete bottleneck or gridlock or veto in the UN Security Council that blocks action, events will move to the UN General Assembly. This is, I think, likely to happen here unless the United States finally realizes that the path that it's on is a complete dead end for everybody, and including for the U.S. to have any role and say, meaning that if the U.S. continues to veto action in the Security Council, it will go to the General Assembly, and we'll find that the world is deeply aligned for peace, for a ceasefire, for a solution to the Palestinian crisis, that is statehood for Palestine. And this will be also a geopolitical earthquake, actually, because I think that the clear shifting lines of the world will become even more clear in ways that are being exposed by the Ukraine and Israel-Palestine crisis right now, but are going to become even more vivid. By the way, if we survive this without terrible devastation, there is a lot of good that can come from this because it is possible to see a multipolar world not only de facto in place, but also de jure in the sense of under the UN Charter and under international law, actually a clear change to a world in which the voice of the world will be heard and determinative in ways that it has not been during this illusory unipolar period of the United States. So maybe we're actually moving to something where global rule of law could actually take shape. But I think, not so sorry to be long-winded on all of this, but the point is that this is a crisis that has not led to people saying, oh, why do we care about the UN? How useless. Quite the contrary. What we're seeing is virtually all nations of the world, other than the US and Israel, coming forward and saying we need solutions that abide by the UN Charter and that are under the responsibility of the UN Security Council. So it has not been the abandonment of international law, but an increased recognition that that's exactly what we need. And because China is very much in that direction, and Russia is seeking this also, and Russian diplomacy put forward the first attempt at a ceasefire, and this was an extremely constructive move. I think that there is really a move with Brazil also very important in its own right, very important because of President Lula's leadership, but also the next president of the G20, where the key underlying economic decisions are going to be taken that will be the fallout of all of these events. This is a changing world before our eyes.
I completely agree. I think one of the things that I've noticed also is that you're seeing all of these comments made around the world, including by ASEAN. This has not been noticed, but they're to some extent perhaps more detached from this, but they've made some very clear statements. And they are talking about international law and the United Nations. They are not talking about this rules-based international order that people in the West talk about. That seems to be of no interest to them at all. It is international law as classically understood, centered on the United Nations, based on the Charter of the United Nations, that countries outside the West are converging around. What do you make of all of these enormous military buildups? Because I think that my own view about this is that this has been excessive and hugely unwise and has added to the tension, and nobody knows exactly what its purpose is. I mean, does the United States itself fully understand the extent to which these huge military deployments have made the situation in the Middle East even more tense and even more dangerous than it might otherwise have been?
Well, when we say the United States, of course, again, we have to think specifically about the personalities involved. And the answer is the leadership is extraordinarily weak. The president is extraordinarily weak in all of this, aged, out of date, with a wrong approach to foreign policy from the day he stepped into office, a promoter of the neoconservative U.S. leadership, indispensable nation ideas for decades. So in this sense, I think the risks of miscalculation are absolutely profound. And I'm sorry to say it, this is a trite point, but an absolutely true one. The possibilities of terrible accidents are extremely grave. We know that American troops are being shot at right now, and we don't know the truth about this, but the war is already spreading right now. We know that there have been attacks in Syria and in Iraq. We don't know, I don't know, at least the details of this at all. There is a tremendous amount of violence, a tremendous amount of hotheads. Netanyahu is certainly one of the most irresponsible politicians on the world scene and has been for a long time. He profoundly divided his own country, which is absolutely spiraling into a deeper and deeper crisis. We have statements that are intemperate, doesn't even begin to describe the vulgarity of statements coming out of some of the Israeli hardliners right now. And in these circumstances, terrible things can happen. That's why the leadership of the UN Secretary General right now is so important, and I think has been remarkable, I must add, and why calm voices from the Chinese leaders is very much appreciated, from Lula, from others. This is needed to help stabilize what is truly an explosive brew right now. And in terms of whether the American leaders understand this, clearly they don't. They're scrambling like mad. They are operating on premises that are completely wrong, and it would take a lot of learning in a short period of time. And bureaucracies also don't learn much. Leaders can make an individual difference, but it would be surprising to me for Biden to rise to the occasion, frankly.
I'm going to speak briefly about other countries. I think I have been very impressed again by the sophistication Brazil is bringing to bear in this crisis, and I have to say I'm deeply dismayed by the fact that Europe is nowhere to be seen. I mean, we are not doing anything remotely useful or constructive in this crisis at all. That I can see there's divisions and there's arguments about the behavior of the president of the European Commission and the role that she has played. But no European government of importance seems to be rising to this situation or acting to calm things. So we see Brazil, which has not been active in diplomacy in the past, is now playing a positive and creative role. And Europe, where diplomacy was born, modern diplomacy was born, is just absented itself entirely.
It's completely stunning. Of course, van der Leyen long ago mortgaged the European Commission to NATO, and maybe even to her personal quest to become the next Secretary General of NATO, though that's a footnote of no special significance. But she has been terrible during this Ukraine crisis, and now completely lost in the current events. Europe itself, of course, is very, and not to say Germany, of course, probably the weakest and most misguided and often loudmouthed foreign ministers that we have, and Germany inherently, because of history, can't really do anything constructive on this. France, whoa, just strangeness coming out of Macron's words. I mean, absolutely bizarre from one day to the next. So no clarity. Of course, France has its own multiple crises and is overwhelmed in its Africa sphere and so forth. So France out of this. Actually, we've heard some sensible words from Prime Minister Meloni in Italy. I was when she attended the forum in Cairo, and that was good to hear. We've heard some sensible things coming from the Spanish government, but this is not a government that it's not even in place right now after elections and still trying to form a coalition. Not a place where one can forge any kind of European leadership. Northern Europe just so completely overwhelmed, I suppose, with Ukraine and with their own crises, not a peep. So Europe plays no guiding role at all. And of course, Europe has a very substantial Muslim population, which is out on the streets protesting, which means that Europe falling in line with, if you could say U.S. policy, there is no policy, but if falling in line with the United States doesn't work at all. So Europe is adrift in this from a diplomatic point of view. Diplomacy has been awful during the whole Ukraine crisis, but it is even more awful and inconsequential now. But I would say one thing: Europe will not block in the UN Security Council or in the UN General Assembly clarity right now to push for a political solution. So Europe will not align automatically with the US, whatever the US leadership decides to do Europe cannot and will not follow lockstep in that, because perhaps unlike the Ukraine crisis, this isn't in the same way a security threat where the U.S. has to hide underneath the U.S. Umbrella, nuclear umbrella, but rather a case where Europe's own internal politics are so much at stake in the Middle East that somebody in Europe's going to have to think about Europe's interests and about ground realities right now. So I think Israel's not going to find any kind of support for this extraordinarily hardline position that Israel has taken, and is going to find itself isolated in that sense too among the European countries.
Professor Sachs, we're up to our 30 minutes and we have a hard stop with you. Thank you very much for finding the time and being as generous as always to come on our programs. And
great to be with you.
Maybe we can also discuss the economics of this, because
there's a lot of that.
Certain views about that as well, I'm sure.
Very good. Great. We'll talk again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. All of Professor Sachs's information, once again, is in the description box down below, and I will also add it as a pinned comment as well. Alexander, let's get to some questions. What do you think?
Yep,
absolutely. Got a lot of interesting questions that we can.
I'm sure.
Discuss with everybody.
Unfortunately, I also have some time constraints, but I can go on for about an hour. And I hope that will cover.
Okay, I think we have about 30 minutes worth of questions. Let's run through them. Once again, thank you to Professor Sachs, and thank you to our moderators. I didn't say a big thank you to our moderators in the beginning of the program, so thank you to everyone that is helping us with this live stream. Let's begin with Northeast Slingshot. No question, just a super chat. Thank you for that, Northeast Slingshot. Let's see. Death Dealer 1341 says, will Russia and China diplomacy save the day? And if the U.S. fears a conflict between Russia and China, then the U.S. should leave the Middle East.
I think it will save the day. I'm going to take this actual view. I think we are heading inexorably to that situation which we've just discussed with Professor Sachs, where we're going to get a big resolution from either from the Security Council, with the US unable to veto it, or at the General Assembly. So I think we will eventually see the situation brought under control, and I think we will see moves towards a full settlement of this crisis, of rather the underlying crisis in the Middle East, the setting up of an international peace conference. The danger is what happens until we get there. We could see extraordinary amounts of violence. I mean, we already are, but the violence has a possibility of spiraling out of control and of getting much worse before we reach that point. But I think that is the point we will eventually reach.
All right. Kev Jones, thank you for that super chat. Elena says, pro-Palestine protests are being forbidden in different countries in Europe. Our free speech is under attack. Why isn't it any discussion about it in the UN or anywhere?
Well, I completely agree with that view. I think that whatever your feelings about this crisis, whichever side you are more supportive of, the right to protest and to discuss these things ought to be in Western democracies, not just Western democracies anywhere, part of one's political and civil rights. And the fact that in Europe, I've noticed, by the way, in the United States, at least not so far, but in Europe, in more and more places, including in Britain, it is being restricted, is an extremely disturbing thing. And I'm going to say that I think that it is not actually even about this crisis at the end of the day. What you are seeing increasingly is that European governments and European authorities are using this crisis to narrow opportunities for public speech even more. And we're seeing misuse of the terrorism acts in Britain, for example. I mean, I don't approve of these acts anyway, the way they've been drafted. But this is what it's about. So what is being done now in response to this crisis is actually more about limiting freedom of speech altogether.
Yeah, never let a crisis go to waste.
Exactly.
That's what Europe is doing. Another brick in the wall says, if a global war seems inevitable, at at what point would you suggest the next flight to the southern hemisphere?
Yeah.
Serious question, unfortunately.
It is a serious question. I mean, we are much closer to a blow up, an apocalyptic disaster than I can remember. Well, I mean, you have to go back to the 1973 Arab-Israeli war for something as dangerous as the situation we potentially have now. And going back to what Professor Sachs was saying, we have a US government that is completely inadequate for the situation, and which, on the contrary, is working overtime to make the situation even more dangerous than it already is. So we are in a very dangerous situation. I don't think we are there yet. I think what is more likely to happen is that we're going to find ourselves with some kind of Israeli military operation in Gaza. I think the pressure in Israel for that is overwhelming because the Israeli government itself has given the impression that that is the solution to the problem. And I think there's going to be a major clash in Gaza. I was on a program yesterday on Twitter Spaces, which, by the way, we will be coming to ourselves fairly soon, but on Twitter Spaces with Elon Musk and David Sachs. And one of the other participants was Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He was talking about the enormous problems that the Israelis could face in Gaza. And I think that the risk there is one of two things will happen. Either that battle becomes bogged down and that causes pressure both in Washington and Jerusalem to escalate to incredibly dangerous levels, taking on Hezbollah as well, and that kind of thing. And if we get into those kind of scenarios, then the situation that you're describing might be the right one, taking a dash for the Southern Hemisphere. I think more likely we will get to the point where the world will say, enough is enough. We have to have this resolution from the General Assembly, and it will happen, and it will be legally binding because a decision based on the Uniting for Peace formula is legally binding. And then, of course, it will be very, very difficult for the United States to continue on that course because I don't like Professor Sachs. I think at that point, European support will fall away.
In two, this is a great question actually. How is denazification for the SMO different from destroy Hamas? Russia is calling for ceasefire, yet will refuse any ceasefire in Ukraine. As like the Israelis, they don't trust the other side.
Well, if we go back to the SMO, what the Russians sought to do at the beginning, in the first 2 months, was to seek negotiations. They wanted negotiations. They were prepared to talk about ceasefires. There were rounds of talks, first in Belarus and then in Turkey, in Istanbul. A draft agreement was reached, and the Russians say that they actually pulled back their troops from Kiev in response to the fact that there was apparently a draft negotiation. The people who, at that time, opted for a military solution were the Western powers and the Ukrainians. And it was the Ukrainians did that under pressure from the Western powers. And that caused the collapse of the negotiating process, and it caused the Russians to feel that negotiations really weren't going to lead to any conceivable potential outcome. And that is why we are now in a situation where the Russians say there cannot be a ceasefire because there is no trust. We took all those steps last year and it didn't work out. And in fact, the Ukrainians and the West took advantage of it, and we're not going to be put in that position again. This time, I think it is different because there will be a ceasefire, but there will be a ceasefire in order to facilitate negotiations. The negotiations last time with Ukraine were going to lead to a ceasefire and then further negotiations, and then that was stopped. This time, the idea is you have negotiations, and those negotiations lead to a ceasefire. I think across the world, including amongst the Arab states, including in Iran, there is an understanding now that Hamas is a problem. It is a very serious problem indeed. No leader, not even the Iranians, has supported Hamas in terms of what Hamas did on the 7th of October. And of course, that's the Iranians. Other countries, Saudi Arabia, for example, have been much stronger. The Russians, the Chinese, they've said that this is absolutely terrible behavior. They've condemned it in unequivocal terms. I think if we get negotiations going, all of the Arab states, all of the great powers, the Russians and the Chinese, they are making it absolutely clear that the body they want to see representing the Palestinians is the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and they want to see Hamas isolated and ultimately eliminated. Now, what is happening, the approach that's been taken at the moment, instead of isolating Hamas, is putting it at the center of the crisis, which is exactly, of course, where it wants to be.
Elena Diaz says, will Turkey stand by the Palestinians till the bitter end? If so, will that be the end of NATO?
The answer is don't put your money on anything Erdogan says on any issue. I think that Erdogan, I think he is, I think, a generally religious person. I think he's profoundly shocked and engaged by this. I think he also understands that Turkish public opinion is wants Turkey to take a role and to support the Palestinians. But I think also with Erdogan, he is always calculating for his own advantage. So he wants to insert Turkey into the diplomatic process. He's just called Putin again and had more discussions with him. And I think that that is the primary objective that Erdogan has. Provided Erdogan is able to position Turkey where it's appearing to play an active role, I think he will be largely satisfied with that. And I think actually that ultimately he's less interested in any eventual outcomes than in, as I say, positioning Turkey in the way that I've just said.
Caves of Chaos 123 says, what is the driving force behind the urge for destruction? Greed or so misguided sense of superiority? Biden is a puppet. Who is the puppet master?
I think one of the major causes for the drive to destruction is fear. I think fear should never be underestimated. I think there's a lot of fear in Israel at the moment. And I think a lot of this rhetoric that we're hearing coming out of Israel, which is alarming and frightening rhetoric in itself, is driven by fear. And let me say again that in terms of Israel and the feelings, not just of Israelis, but of Jewish people, given what happened in the 20th century, given what happened in Europe in the 20th century, given what Germany did to the Jewish people in the 20th century, you cannot say that these fears are without foundation. They are founded. So I mean, one has to say this. So fear partly is what drives this. Fear on the part of Palestinians as well, that they will be completely displaced from their historic territory and will disappear as a people. So there is fear. But of course, there is also what we in Greeks call hubris, the idea that you are the most powerful, the most indispensable, that you have the right to decide everything yourself, and then deep anger when you discover that your plots, your schemes, your plans are not working out, and your tendency in that case to try to reinforce the policy that you are taking. So if you're talking about US policy, I think it is this idea, this desire on the part of this small group of people who have gained control of US foreign policy to control and subordinate all the processes of the world towards their own objective. And that, of course, is unachievable. It is unrealizable. It is dangerous because, of course, the only way you can execute that or think you can is by doubling down. And that is what these people always do.
Isabel, thank you for that super sticker. Jungle Jingle says, will the U.S. abandon Israel if they feel it's too detrimental to its position, or will sentimentality prevail over reason in the U.S.?
Well, I don't think so. And you know something, I hope not. I mean, I absolutely do not hope not. What I think the best thing to happen would be for the United States to start to play a constructive role, trying to work with other countries around the world towards achieving a long-term sustainable situation to the crisis in the Middle East. I think if the US simply abandoned Israel to its fate, given that Israel, of course, is a nuclear power, that would be extremely dangerous. Given the fears Israeli people have, it would be extremely dangerous. I think it would amount, in a kind of a sense, to a sort of betrayal, because, as I said over the course of the program with Professor Sachs, I think that if Israel had not had the kind of backing from the United States that it has had for so many years, but especially over the last 30 years, when the United States has believed that it has, this unipolar moment and all of that, I think that Israeli policy might very well have been very different than it has instead been. So I hope that they don't just abandon Israel and walk away. I think, on the contrary, what they should responsibly do is work with everybody to calm the situation, bring it under control, and try to work forward towards some crisis, a resolution of this crisis. Can you expect that of Blinken and Nuland and Sullivan and Biden? Of course not. But there are other people in the United States who I do think understand that.
Fragments of USSR. Zhirinovsky said, Ukraine is finished. There will be no elections in 2024. The Middle East is greater. World War III is being prepared there. All refugees will go to what is left of Ukraine. Wonder what else he knew and how long was this in the making?
You know, this prophecy of Zhirinovsky's made before he died is now being widely commented upon in Russia itself. And of course, Zhirinovsky was an extremely educated and in many ways insightful and intelligent man. He was absolutely not the clown-like figure that people in the West believe. And this is a good example of Zhirinovsky, in some ways, very insightful, very connected to actual events in the world, but also with a certain degree of over-dramatization. I agree with, I think what he's saying about Ukraine might very well be true. But I think this plan, this idea that you can somehow relocate Israel to Ukraine is a preposterous one. And I don't think it's going to happen.
Jeremiah says, do you feel the UN has outlived its usefulness and another entity is needed to fit today's world?
No, I don't think it's outlived its usefulness. I think it needs significant reform to reflect the modern realities. But people need to understand that the whole structure of international law is constructed around the UN. It was what we have and what created the international system of law that we know today. The people who want to destroy international law, who want to replace it by the rules-based order that they incessantly talk about, where nobody knows what the rules are precisely those people who have been trying to undermine the UN and who have brought us to the disastrous position that we are now in.
Sanjeva says, so Hamas is an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood, which is funded by Qatar. Muslim Brotherhood fights Russia and Syria and in Chechnya in the past, but Hamas is the enemy of the US, but Qatar is an ally of the USA and Russia is bad. What?
I mean, Sanjeva, you've got it exactly right. It is a ghastly, horrible mess, and it is the product of US policy. The US wants to use organizations like Hamas in places like Syria. Hamas fighters went to fight Assad's government in Syria. And of course, as we all know, the so-called moderate resistance, which of course was based on the Muslim Brotherhood, the organization that has ideological affinity with Hamas, They were the core of the resistance to Assad, especially in the early part of the war, and they received funding from Qatar. And Qatar is the country that bankrolls the Muslim Brotherhood, and which, in all of these adventures, was the ally of the United States, both in the Syrian war and in the war in Libya. So you see how these policies that the United States follows lead ultimately and invariably to bad outcomes.
Yeah. That is why they're all trying to distance themselves from Hamas now.
Yeah.
The United States is saying that Iran is backing Hamas, and Erdogan, he's signing the NATO accession of Sweden, because we all know that Erdogan is deeply connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is deeply connected to Hamas. And they're all now trying to distance themselves from Hamas. And you even have statements from people like Blinken saying that Putin and Russia is somehow, in this thing with Hamas, which is complete fiction, because it was the Russians. It was the Russians, the Iranians, and most importantly, the Syrians that demolished IS, which was fighting alongside Hamas.
Exactly.
So this lie about Russia and Hamas is a freaking lie. No. It is a lie. And all of these people in the collective West that were trying to use Hamas to overthrow Assad, and that includes Erdogan, and that includes the United States moderate rebels. Obama put out a Medium blog post the other day, and he's warning Biden to not, to calm down a bit, but he's also saying that they have the right to demolish Assad, to demolish Hamas. It was the Obama White House with Biden as vice president that was funding moderate rebels. Yeah, moderate rebels, i.e., Hamas, Al Qaeda, and IS. That's what moderate rebels were.
Absolutely, and you bear in mind this is all completely fungible. So you get Hamas fighters going to fight in Syria, and they get training there. They get training from the people who the US is training, and they are getting the funding that comes to the moderate rebels from the US, and it finds its way back to Hamas. This is the
training
disaster.
Weapons,
and they're getting the weapons from all kinds of places, allegedly even from Ukraine as well. This is what neocon policies do. It's the mess that they've all created.
Freaking mess. Nicholas Walker says the idea of sending in warships used to be a yes minister sketch instead of stage one diplomacy. Trump looking as a national choice is concerning.
Well, can I just say, I think you're fundamentally right about deploying military forces. I mean, if you are deploying huge numbers of troops in the way that you're doing, first of all, you have to have a plan. Now, we did a program on the Duran in which the only discernible plan is attack everybody. And that does seem to be, you only have to listen to and follow and track what some of these people are saying. They seem to want a larger war with all of this. Whereas, of course, US interests, global interests, are served not in having a wider war, but in calming things down. And these massive troop deployments are incredibly dangerous. They're already provoking counter reactions. We see this, the Russians deploying their MiG-31 fighters with the hypersonic missiles and the warnings from Putin. And this has every potential to spiral out of control.
G-Dog says Russia is calling for a ceasefire on civilians.
Yeah, well, they're calling for a ceasefire so that there is a peace thing with civilians. What I think everybody wants to see happen is they want to see the situation brought under control. Everybody, let me repeat again, everybody understands that what Hamas did was extraordinarily terrible and evil. Everybody has said this. Everybody who matters has said this. But I think that there is an understanding in Moscow, in Beijing, even to some extent in Tehran, by the way, and I know people have different views about Tehran, that what Hamas did was intended to create the kind of crisis that we see, because it's put Hamas right at the center. They're able to say, we are the Palestinian resistance. We are the people who are resisting the Israelis. we are luring the Israelis into a trap in Gaza, escalating in the way that some people seem to want, is playing exactly to the plan that Hamas has.
Garland Nixon says free Assange and Palestine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Garland, for that.
Thank you, Garland. Good to
yes,
have you on,
good,
by the way.
Good to have you on, and we have to have Garland on
Yeah,
show very
absolutely.
soon if he will do us the honor. Tim Gibson, thank you for that super sticker. Salma says, I think we have entered a new military era. Much of the military equipment is proving to be obsolete, like horses and bright uniforms going into World War I.
Well, you're absolutely correct. And this is one of the big lessons about the Ukrainian war. I mean, lots of things that people thought worked, turns out that they don't. I'm not an expert on these things, but I'm sure many people who are watching this program are aware that the Russians captured something called the Slag Heap near Avdiivka. And they did this in a very sophisticated way using small FPV drones, which I would never have thought once upon a time would be an effective weapon. But it turns out that they are an extremely effective weapon indeed. Whereas by contrast, these big lumbering drones that everybody has been developing and spending so much time, including the Russians, processing, it turns out that they don't actually work terribly well in these kind of combat environments. So we're learning an awful lot about the changing nature of war from this big war that is happening in Ukraine right now. And to be frank, I'm not an expert on this, but I suspect that aircraft carriers, for example, most probably have had their day. I know lots of people have been saying this for many years, but I think that the evidence is starting to point conclusively in that direction.
Tristan says, why exactly do the money changers who control Biden and co want war? I can't help thinking it's part of a master plan for our species.
But you may very well be right. But of course, if they do, I come back to what I have repeatedly said. He who sows crisis can find themselves in disaster. He who sows the storm can reap the whirlwind. They will themselves be swept away if they do that. They're misguided if they think otherwise. That has been the repeated lesson of previous revolutions and world affairs. That was true of what happened in Russia. It was true, by the way, equally of what happened in France. People don't realize it, but the French Revolution started as a movement by members of the aristocracy to weaken the power of the king. And in the event, it was they who got swept away along with the king.
Jeffrey Brown says, apart from the temporary flowerings of philosophical advance, we seem trapped in a cycle of one feudalist system after another. Why? Is it economics, human nature, evolutionary dead end, or is it an immutable law of physics? I'm stumped.
I'm a bit less pessimistic about things than you. I think that humanity does move forward, but of course it moves forward in unexpected ways. Sometimes there's zigzags, sometimes there's terrible regressions, as we saw in Europe in the mid-20th century. But ultimately, things do right themselves or have done so up to now, and I'm hoping that they still will. But at least that's what I want to believe, because if hope dies, if we give way to despair, then we're much more likely to get those kind of outcomes. As I say many times, despair is a bad counselor.
Rob 101 says, with two carrier groups on station or en route to the East Mediterranean, is the U.S. seeking to attack Syria and or Iran?
I think so. I think there are some people who actually do want that. Whether they will get their way is, of course, another matter. But
Definitely
why else do you need to send two big carrier groups? I mean, it's wildly overstated, overreaction. It is a massive overreaction. It's an even bigger concentration of power, as somebody pointed out to me, than what the United States did at the time of the 1973 war.
Sanjeva says that Duran is more important than ever as a source of informative, independent, and neutral source of news in these confusing and dangerous times. Thank you, Sanjeva, for that. Thank you very much. G-Dog says, whatever happened to the UN militarily response to any genocidal wars? Is it simply discorded after Slick Willie Clinton denied intervention in Rwanda?
Well, the short answer is, first of all, you've got to be very, very careful when you talk about things like that, because, of course, we've got the whole R2P, responsibility to protect doctrine, that was invented by Tony Blair, which basically said, well, we don't really need international law when these things happen. We, the Western powers, because we see further and know better, we can intervene directly to prevent those kind of things. There is a very great danger when you start using the G word in that kind of way, that you're opening yourself up for manipulation. The reason the United Nations has proved ineffectual is because it is still fossilized in the structures that existed at the end of the Second World War. It's still dominated by what are essentially European powers and the Americans. And of course, that doesn't reflect the realities of the world today. And that is breeding paralysis.
European powers. France should be removed from the Security Council, as should the UK. And India and Brazil should take their place, because Europe is represented by the US anyway. So, I mean, there's no reason to have three.
Yeah.
There's no point in it. Iskander Zalarinen says, is the naval build in Eastern Med a precursor for a strike in Syria and Iran? Could this be the beginning of World War III? We kind of answered that.
Well, I think we've just answered that question.
Yeah, we answered that,
I'm convinced that agenda does exist.
Tristan says, Alexander shared thoughts on why aircraft carriers are better placed in the Red Sea. Diego Garcia, U.S. Navy base off Somalia with GPS tower might be in reach.
Well, you're now asking me questions that go far beyond my areas of knowledge. I have heard that the Eisenhower is going to be deployed to the Red Sea. I've also heard that this is a response to Putin's statement about the MiG-31 fighters over the Black Sea with the hypersonic missiles there. But I've also heard that MiG-31 fighters operating over the Caspian Sea have the range with their hypersonic missiles to strike at carrier groups in the Red Sea. So, that's all I can tell you. I can't tell you more. This isn't, these are issues of military technologies and strategies which are far beyond my areas of knowledge.
Diane Wild, welcome to Duran Community. Sanjalin Vlastelica says, if the premise is that the U.S. foreign policy is driven by military industrial profits, then everything else magically falls into place. I love and share your viewpoints, but aren't we just sadly idealistic?
Well, I think you're right. I think the underpinning this.
Same for the Ukraine situation, by the way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right fundamentally. And we have all of these people with all these terrible ideological ideas, but ultimately what funds them, the people who make sure that these people are powerful, who fund the think tanks, who lobby in Congress, are the very people that you say, and for the reasons that you say.
Yeah, just remember that the ideology is the mission statement. Every business has a mission statement, right? Which drives the people to work harder and to sell the products and make profits. Exactly. It's the same thing for the war machine. So exactly. The neocon ideology, that's the vision and the mission statement of the actual business. That's what drives them to create more war. Far, thank you for that super chat. Elza says, gentlemen, you spoil us with the best analysis every day. Sometimes I take it for granted until I talk to others who have no clue. Thank you. Thank you, Elza, for that. And Elza also says, and why has Ukraine to be on offensive, but Israel is being stopped?
Well, I'm not going to discuss the tactics. In the case of Israel, I think that there is growing alarm within the militaries, both in Israel and the United States, that this is going to create problems. But I also come back to what we discussed in that program. It could be that they need time to complete their naval deployments. And that is something that should not be underestimated.
Sam K says, if this goes all out, will Syria use this as an opportunity to take back the Al Tanf border crossing, or will they keep their military back?
Who knows? I don't know. I don't know what else Assad is going to do. If we get into an all-out war situation, I think any plans anybody might have will go up in smoke anyway.
Zariel says, could it have been a false flag Netanyahu needs to distract?
I don't think so. For one thing, I don't think in the end that this is playing out to his advantage. I mean, I know people think otherwise, but he looked to me pretty secure as prime minister before this happened. And I think that the crisis that we have now is very difficult for him.
Nick says, what's the deal with these pop culture stickers on Ukrainian soldiers' uniforms like Babi Yada or characters from The Mandalorian? It seems Baby Yoda. Oh yeah, from The Mandalorian. It seems pretty bizarre given the seriousness of the situation.
Yeah, but
I misread that. Yeah.
It is something I think that soldiers do. I mean, I don't think this is completely, unusual. I mean, when people are under intense stress, they do put on these sort of patches and things. I don't take that badly, to be honest. When they put symbols of a different kind, reminiscent of those of the German army in the 1940s, that I find much more troubling.
Liam, thank you for joining the Duran community. Guys, how about the lineup of 2030 races?
I'm not sure I understand that, but anyway.
How about the lineup? I'm not sure I understand that, Liam. Elena says the Gray Zone did a report a long time ago and spoke how Israeli soldiers aimed at Palestinian children walking to and from school. Why isn't Palestinian anger understandable?
Yeah, I mean, it is understandable. I mean, it doesn't justify what happened on the 7th of October. And I think that's another thing to say, because, Palestinian children have been killed. It doesn't entitle people to go and kill Israeli children, which undoubtedly did happen. So, I mean, let's not slip into that kind of thing. The Secretary General at the UN did place all of these events in historic context, and that provoked a reaction which I think was misjudged, catastrophically misjudged, and which Professor Sachs talked about.
Claudia says, does gas the Jews seem like freedom of speech? The Australian government seems to think so. I am really shocked by the racism coming from groups who up until now have been calling all of us racists.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I entirely agree with that. I mean, it basically tells you something about, the way in which that particular word is used.
Yeah, and thank you for that super chat. Liam says, U.S. President at Jackson Hinkle, Chinese President Xi Jinping, and of course, Russian President at Khabib Nurmagomedov. Who you think? Love your programs, guys.
I don't know. I'm not sure what I don't know quite how to respond to that one, actually.
I'm not sure. Thank you for that. Liam, Khabib, the MMA fighter, I believe. That's who you're talking about. Great fighter. ThinkPad20 says, thoughts on Erdogan increasingly sharp rhetoric in support of Palestine and against Israel. He recently praised Hamas. How will he go?
Yeah, I should say, I mean, Erdogan is somebody to keep very careful eye on. And of course, what he's doing is, on the one hand, he's positioning himself and Turkey to bring himself into a more prominent position. He's responding also to Turkish opinion and to his political base. And at the same time, he's also being very careful, as Alex said, to keep on track with the Western powers. Though it's not a coincidence that he's now authorizing Swedish entries into NATO. You could see this is the way he plays this game constantly, all the time.
Jungle Jin says, while acknowledging Hamas atrocities, Norman Finkelstein refuses to judge Hamas, comparing their actions to the slave revolts of the 19th century.
Well, I mean that's him, Norman Finkelstein. I mean he's entitled. He can take whatever position he likes. I take a different position.
Jerry Fairchild says, declare NATO for what it really is, North Atlantic terrorist organization.
No, okay.
And Jungle Jin says, get Norman Finkelstein on the show urgently.
Well, perhaps.
Perhaps. Good try, yeah. Liam Barrett says, Alex Alexander wanted to buy a torch recently. Remembered in the early days of the show that you used to.
Oh, yes, the Patriot
them,
Beacon,
yeah.
a great torch,
The
by the way.
Patriot
I still have
Beacon,
mine.
yes.
You'll use it all the time. By all means, buy it.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Sophisticated Caveman says, can you guys do a show on the current political positions of Iran? There's zero clear objective info on this.
It's a very good thing.
In the American media.
We probably will, actually, because Iran is a very interesting country. And this has been a difficult crisis. This is a difficult crisis for them as well, by the way. And they're having to maneuver very carefully.
Passion Bohemian says, hello, gents. I just got into your live stream. Thank you for all the great work you guys do every day to inform us. Thank you for that. Really appreciate it. That girl Casey says, I was happy to hear Alexander in the X Space. I look forward to Duran X Space's Twitter needs you two more than ever. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you. And thank you for your kind words.
Thank you for that. And thank you for David Sachs for hosting.
It was a wonderful program, actually. Very, very wonderful program. And I learned a lot from it.
Mandalorian 25, thank you for that super chat. Jangle Jingle says, it seems the U.S. believes it will be a regional conflict, judging by troop placement and buildup. No reinforcement to Europe or Asia, only into the Middle East.
Yes. Well, you see, this is where we have the potential for one miscalculation after the other. They believe, but how do they know?
Yeah. Liam Barrett says, Alex Alexander, X Space with @Jackson Hinkle.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Mandalorian 25 says, Croesus controlled the Senate. It didn't end well.
Yeah.
Croesus controlled the Senate. It didn't end well.
Controlled the Senate.
Yeah,
it didn't end well at all for him. He got killed in Persia, by the way, fighting the Parthians.
Raphael says, Alexander, would you agree that Plato warned us exactly to stay away from this form of democracy? Why do you think we never listened to him?
He's a much more complicated thinker than people realize. And I would say that, of course, he wrote his dialogues, and they contain very powerful and very insightful criticisms of the kind of democracy that existed in the ancient Greece and in specifically ancient Athens. But at the academy, the academy often drafted constitutions for Greek city-states, and they tended to be based on democracy. So, be careful about assuming things that Plato says. I think Plato is one of the most interesting and insightful writers on political affairs there has ever been. He is surpassed by his pupil, Aristotle, who is a tremendous person who thinks about politics and that kind of thing. Why do we not heed the advice of these people? Look at our leaders today. Do you think they read Plato and Aristotle? Do you really think that, Jake Sullivan sits down and reads his Aristotle? Of course he does.
Zariel says, do you all see the Israeli granny shake the Hamas soldier's hand once she was released? Shows a completely different picture to reports of the West.
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen that picture.
Transport says Hamas reputation as a terrorist group is in jeopardy. The hostage they released gave them a raving review, thanked them for their hospitality, and shook their hands on the way out.
Yeah, okay, fine. But, I mean, there are also the events that happened on the 7th of October. I think what's happened, by the way, is that Hamas, the leadership of Hamas, have understood that they went the situation that took what happened on the 7th of October, in the end didn't play out well for them. So they're now trying to distance themselves from this. They wanted to provoke an Israeli reaction. They've achieved that objective. Now they want to show another side.
Yeah, the problem with all of this is that the Biden White House, in their infinite stupidity, they said that until all the hostages are released, they're not going to green light a ground operation. So I mean, he shouldn't have said that. That was just a dumb statement.
Incentivizes Hamas to hold on to the hostages. I mean, they make one mistake after another.
I wish Biden would just keep his mouth.
Yeah.
Tristan says only golden retrievers can stop World War III. Thanks.
Oh, absolutely. As the owner of two, I can confirm that.
Monica, thank you for that super chat. And Pat Cat says, my wife told me yesterday there were U.S. and NATO troops at the Chisinau airport in Moldova.
I believe that's true.
I think there's NATO floating all around there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Walter Washington says, Russia has been the neocons' great white whale since the end of the Cold War, and we know how that story ended. I watch your program every day. Thank you for your great work. Very
well put. So well put. We become. Listening to Biden, he is Captain Ahab. He is obsessed with Russia. What is it? Those words, in death do I grapple with thee. I mean, it is totally obsessional.
They all are. Hillary, Biden, they go and meet with Putin, and they understand that Putin's smarter than them, and they get all pissed off, and they hold this grudge. That's what happened with Biden. He met with Putin. Putin talked about stuff that Biden couldn't comprehend, and Biden probably felt humiliated, and now he has this grudge. That's just the way these people act. Deborah said, human animals mowing the grass, open air prisons, settlers killing Palestinians with impunity. Isn't Hamas's action understandable?
Well, it can be explained, and that is what the Secretary General was doing yesterday. But when you use a word like understandable, be careful, because that can also sound sometimes, when you say something is understandable, you can also appear to be saying, well, one could even come close to saying that it's justified in some kinds of ways. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that is what you're saying. But in this kind of situation, you have to choose your words very carefully. And I thought, by the way, that Guterres, just for the record, Guterres, the Secretary General, did. I think he was very careful in his choice of words.
G-Dog says, did you guys mention the 6 ships China sent to the Mideast? Garland Nixon did a great show on Russia and China protecting their strategic interests.
Yes, there's all sorts of people came back to me when we did our program the other day and said, well, the Chinese do regular deployments to this part of the world as part of anti-pirate missions. I'm sure this is true, but this is a much bigger deployment than usual. Clearly, the Chinese are making moves.
Yeah. Elza says, did this end Greta Thunberg's career?
Probably. I have to say, I hope so. I mean, I'm not going to say more. I find the whole Greta phenomenon really rather, it makes me very queasy, let me put it like that.
NGS says, do you think the early assumptions that Russia would run out of ammunition in Ukraine was based on the size of U.S. and Western stocks and production capacity?
Yes, in a word. I mean, inconceivable for these people that the Russians could do what we cannot.
Lada Moreau says, thank you, gentlemen, for your everyday hard work and analysis of geopolitics. Looking forward to Alexander's Wednesday stream on Locals today.
Absolutely, of course.
Today's stream. Yeah, the Duran.locals.com. The Duran.locals.com. It's free to join. Please go to that site, and this evening at
1400 hours Eastern time and 1900 hours London time.
1900 hours London time. Alexander does his exclusive live stream Q&A, a pure Q&A.
Yeah.
Thank you, Latimer, for that. Theron says the Zionist colonial state of Israel has only its own politicians and actions to blame for whatever happens. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Free Palestine.
I think that there is a wide degree of blame which can be shared out amongst many people. British policies, for example, during the interwar years and afterwards, policies pursued by the United States, policies pursued by many powers. So I don't think one should just focus on one party here. Undoubtedly, the Israelis themselves have played a significant role. Obviously, they have, but that doesn't acquit the responsibility of others.
Raphael says, by prediction, once the war is over, there will be two states. Israel will become too expensive for Israel. Civil war will break out. Jewish people will leave. Palestine will be whole.
Well, I'm not going to predict that far. I think that there has to be I think there will be a big movement towards some kind of long-term solution. What that is going to be, I'm not going to try and guess. I don't know the region, the internal politics of this region well enough. I do believe that most Israelis and most Palestinians, by which I mean the vast majority, want to see a final resolution of this problem so that they can each live safely, prosperously, and in peace.
Abinoza, thank you for that super sticker. Death Dealer says, this isn't a question, but on Twitter, someone said that Russia will attack Poland on January 28th, 2024, which I clearly don't believe.
Well, it's not going to happen.
You're right to not believe.
You're right
that.
on the
Truth, welcome to the Duran community. And Jungle Jin says, the fact you have a deep difference with Finkelstein would make it an interesting show with thought-provoking debate. Both sides are worth airing.
I read him regularly. I think some of his pieces are very, very correct. I think that a lot of what he writes is driven by anger. This is my own personal view. And anger can sometimes lead you to say more than you should.
Okay. Let me just do a final check. I think that's everything.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you to our moderators, Zariel, Valies, Peter. Who else? Am I missing anybody? I don't think so. I think I got all our moderators there. Thank you for all the help that you guys provide us and provide our community. Thank you to everyone that is watching us on Rockfin, on Odyssey, Rumble. Thank you to everyone watching us on Rumble, and to everybody that is watching us on the Duran.locals.com. Once again, tonight, 1900 London time, Alexander will have his Q&A on the Duran.locals.com. The link is in the description box down below. And thank you to everyone that was watching us, that is watching us on YouTube as well. Hit that like button. Help our community grow. It seems like we're stuck. As far as growth goes anyway. What could we do? All right. Let's wrap it up. Alexander, any final thoughts before we sign out?
Well, I mean, it's an incredibly tense time, but again, thanks everybody for interacting with us in the way that they are, and enormously important for us to do these programs at this time. And of course, when we're fortunate to have Professor Sachs and people like him speaking, we're grateful for that too.
Thank you to Professor Jeffrey Sachs as well. Once again, his information is in the description box down below, as well as a pinned comment. Take care, everybody.